The White House said it was highly unlikely, but the Iran ceasefire extension is now in force. President Trump agrees to wait before delivering on threats to recommence bombing Iran. But can the extension hold until a peace deal is reached? Or is the world facing the prospect and consequences of a drawn-out war? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Well, to use an overused reference, it's starting to feel like Groundhog Day in the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. Another deadline to either reach a deal or Iran will be crushed has turned out to be rather flexible. That's good news, of course, especially for the people of Iran, but for those looking for calm in the global chaos, it's anything but. And the concern now is that this could become a protracted conflict, whereby the Strait of Hormuz remains highly unstable. So in the lead up to what's expected to be another round of talks in Islamabad, here's a look at where things stand now.
It's the ceasefire with an expiration date that always approaches but never arrives. With less than a day before it was supposed to end, Donald Trump announced on Tuesday that he would extend the ceasefire until Iran came up with a proposal and submitted it, or discussions were concluded. Mahdi Mohammadi, an advisor to the Iranian parliament speaker, took to X, saying the latest statement from Trump had no meaning. The blockade of Iran continues, and the loser cannot dictate the terms. Both sides have been accusing each other of violating the ceasefire.
We witnessed that the United States insisted on bad faith and violation of the ceasefire. All of this is the evidence that the United States apparently does not show seriousness in the diplomatic process.
In the early hours of Monday, the US Navy seized an Iranian ship, the Tuska. The US said it was trying to evade the blockade.
We're prepared to subject you to disabling fire.
Iran's authorities called the US actions piracy. And on Tuesday, US forces boarded an oil tanker in the Indian Ocean, the Tiffany, between Iran and India. The US alleged the tanker was shipping Iranian oil. But Iran's Revolutionary Guard has also been targeting ships. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, headed by the Royal Navy, said an Iranian Revolutionary Guard gunboat attacked a container ship without any radio warning 15 nautical miles off the coast of Oman. The bridge reportedly sustained heavy damage. The war's effects are rippling across the globe.
The current regional situation stands at a critical juncture. Transitioning between war and peace, the paramount priority remains to make every effort to prevent a resumption of hostilities.
For the first time since the war began, China is set to cut petrol and diesel prices domestically. Beijing sets the retail price of petrol every 10 working days and has raised it several times since the war began. But China is not as dependent on oil as the US president often claims. Meanwhile, the European Energy Commissioner said even if the war ended today, it would take several weeks for oil to reach European markets from the Middle East. But getting gas re-established would take longer.
Even in that situation, on gas, it'll take more than a couple of years to get back to the production levels that we have now.
In Iran, people celebrated the extension of the ceasefire. In the city streets, a ballistic missile put on display, a show of pride in Iran's defiance in the face of US aggression. The longer the stalemate between the sides drags on, the greater the risk is of the war becoming a frozen conflict.
Joining me now to debate what's happened and where the ceasefire is going are, from the Iranian capital, Assistant Professor of West Asian Studies at the University of Tehran, Elham Kadkhodaee. From Manama, Bahrain, Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Hasan Alhasan. And from Washington, founder of the Sheridan Media Group and former national spokesperson for the Republican National Committee, Kevin Sheridan. Thanks all so much for being with me. Elham, I'll begin with you. As an Iranian, How did you respond to the ceasefire extension? Were you among those on the streets cheering alongside those missiles we saw, or are you kind of more reluctant, feeling that this is indeed a ploy to buy time for a surprise strike, as some in your government have said?
Well, I think most people in Iran have been very much pessimistic about this ceasefire, and that's only because of the experience we have had with being attacked twice in the middle of negotiations. So people believe that the American administration, as we know it now, is not an entity that would respect a ceasefire. In the case of the Israelis right now, we're seeing that on a daily basis, they are breaking the ceasefire in Lebanon and in Gaza. So basically, the Iranian people are and have been prepared for the worst. We're like in a situation, so there's so much uncertainty that people believe, whether it's the people on the streets or the politicians, they believe that they should be prepared for any possibility.
Right now, though, I mean, as for where the ceasefire stands, the United States says it's waiting for Iran to submit a new plan to the United States for consideration. Is that what you expect Tehran to do?
Well, the Iranians are saying that we are waiting for the Americans to lift the blockade, the naval blockade that they have put in place, because according to international law, a blockade is an act of war. So you cannot say technically that we are in a ceasefire whilst you are enforcing a blockade. So that's the Iranian perspective. That's what the Iranians believe that they should expect from the American side. They believe that right now the ball is in the American court, and they should decide whether they want to go on with the negotiations and the talks or not. And that's completely related to the issue of the blockade.
Kevin, let me ask you, I mean, do you feel there's a stalemate here that's not being admitted to from Washington's side right now? Or does it benefit the U.S. to kind of buy time at this point, as Iran, some in Iran at least, are saying is happening?
Well, clearly, we are in a stalemate. Donald Trump is looking for a negotiating partner, and obviously there are factions, on the Iranian side, and they need to figure out who's going to speak for the nation. And but to be clear on the blockade was a response to the Iranian attacks on ships. So, I think both sides could back down. They could both, open the strait completely, no attacks, let commerce flow freely, and get to the negotiating table. But Donald Trump's been very clear on this for 30, 40 years that Iran's not going to get a nuclear weapon. And it came as a surprise to a lot of even people in my party that they went ahead with this attack. But it shouldn't really have, because it's been a clear position of this president for a very long time.
Let me ask you, though, something, Kevin, because President Trump said that, I quote, at the request of Pakistan, they've extended the ceasefire. Let me ask if you really think it is, Pakistan's push to, or is it actually the U.S. trying to look like they're being the better guys here and gave into a friendly appeal?
I think Donald Trump is looking for a way out of this. He wants an end to this conflict. He wants the nuclear material secured. I don't know if it was actually Pakistan that did that. They are helping with the negotiations, obviously, but I think this is being run directly out of the White House, and it's really up to the decision of one person. He's looking for an out. Iran can't go on forever like this. The economy obviously will be hurt very badly. Our markets aren't being hurt that badly right now, but it benefits the entire world to find a solution to this and to sign some sort of deal.
Speaking of economies hurting, then, Hasan, let me ask you kind of a similar question. And what about Pakistan here? Because its economy is suffering, very much so, from the blockade, but they are obviously the key mediators. So how much influence do they have? And do you expect, if this round does take place in Islamabad, for real pressure to be on, not just from the two at the table, the two main partners at the table, but from other influences involved?
Yeah, Pakistan has a very strong vested interest in the success of these negotiations because its economy is extremely dependent on the Gulf region. Obviously, there's the dependence on Gulf energy flows. Pakistan imports a lot of its cooking gas, a lot of its oil and gas as well from this part of the world, and that has been disrupted. But keep in mind as well that the region is an important trading partner for Pakistan, and there are millions of Pakistani nationals who earn a living in the Gulf states and send significant remittances back to Pakistan, which also play a key role in the Pakistani economy. So really, Pakistan has a vested economic interest. It has a vested security interest as well, because Pakistan has a large Shia minority and doesn't essentially want to import Middle Eastern conflicts into its own domestic societal landscape. So it also runs that risk, not to mention the fact that it has a long border with Iran. So Pakistan has a very strong interest in the success of these negotiations. It doesn't necessarily have influence over the negotiating parties themselves. It doesn't have a lot of leverage over Washington or over Tehran, but it can use its good offices with all of these various parties to really offer a table for them to negotiate around. And so long as both the Iranians and the Americans see an interest in negotiating and de-escalating, Pakistan can remain relevant to this equation. Now, it has received financial support from Saudi Arabia and Qatar as well, even though the UAE withdrew a few $1 billion in central bank deposits, but it's getting the support from the Saudis and the Qataris to compensate for that and to help them muddle through economically until the situation de-escalates more permanently.
Hasan, I have to ask you then, from your perspective, who's not delivering on the ceasefire agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? Iran had said that the U.S. didn't stop Israel's bombing of Lebanon, as we heard from Elham. The U.S. says Iran was supposed to open the strait and then didn't. Is one party, from your perspective, to blame, or are they both equally at fault?
Well, I think there's quite a degree of uncertainty and lack of clarity about what the initial terms of that ceasefire was to begin with. I mean, we've heard everything and its contrary from both sides of this equation, both from President Trump and from Iran. And if you look at the Iranian side of the equation, Iran can't seem to make up its mind whether the Strait of Hormuz is going to be open or closed. And in any case, irrespective of what the Iranians say, clearly the threat level in the region is too high for the shipping industry to resume navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. And when Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz open, the very next day, the IRGC Navy put out a statement suggesting that actually much of the waterway was mined, and that even though it seemed, at least from the American perspective, that the understanding was for navigation to be resumed completely and for the strait to be fully open, clearly the Iranians were still trying to channel shipping through the lanes that they had unilaterally imposed through the IRGC Navy. So, and at the same time, I mean, President Trump hasn't been very coherent either in what he is meant to be doing. So I think there's a lack of clarity and there's a high degree of uncertainty that creates, I think, a very difficult situation. And I think, honestly, both sides are probably not behaving in a manner that is most conducive to the success of these negotiations in any case.
Right. Let me turn to Kevin then, because Kevin, if you really do believe, and you think the Trump administration believes, even though it has flip-flopped on this a number of times, if the issue is purely about the nuclear program, we know Iran, first of all, President Trump, we have to remember, said that the program had been destroyed in the 12-day war. Fine. Now he's saying it's still there and Iran can go forward. If that is the issue, and Iran has come out and said that, it's willing to put this 5-year suspension on, would you hope that that would be enough to at least stop this conflict for now, let the global economy get back on track, and then perhaps, I don't want to say kick the can further down the line, but at least get more time to do real negotiations for the nuclear program, if that is the key issue?
Well, if you're saying a temporary 5-year while they still negotiate something else, maybe, but the 5 years is a non-starter with the domestic audience here because Donald Trump and the entire Republican Party has run against the JCPOA, which was a 10-year plan to kick the can down the road that Obama instituted. And there's no political support for that in this country whatsoever. I think they started with 20 or 15 years. So you may get baby steps towards something, but it's not going to ultimately last if that number will not be 5 years. But honestly, they need to get the strait open. They need to stop attacking ships, and if that happens, I think you see the blockade drop, and the negotiations commence.
How much longer can the U.S. public hold out?
That's a great question. We're in the process of going into the midterm elections in Congress here. Republicans are not dropping their support for Donald Trump right now, but there's a limit to this, and you can't go on forever. Gas prices can't be at $5 forever, but they're willing to let him negotiate. They're willing to let this play out. Every president since 1979 has said, Iran can't get nuclear weapons, and Donald Trump finally did something about it. So he's got a base of support for that. How long can they take the gas price pain? Months, but not years.
Okay, because I just have one more question for Hasan before we get on to whether or not this could be a protracted conflict and whether it will become a kind of frozen conflict that we're going to be paying the price for 4 years to come. But Hasan, let me ask you this, because we also have Iran's Gulf neighbors in the equation. And you've noted that the Gulf states, they are pretty deeply divided. The UAE, for example, wants the IRGC taken out of the equation entirely. You've said Bahrain is more or less aligned with that position, but others like Qatar want to see immediate de-escalation. So how do you reconcile that? And then whose position do you think the U.S. is defending here more?
Yeah, the Gulf states are in fact divided. They want different things, or at least they believe that addressing Iran, they obviously all agree that Iranian attacks are a threat. They're a threat to their security. They've all been subjected to it, albeit to varying degrees, with the UAE having received really the lion's share of Iranian missile and UAV attacks, more than twice the amount that Iran has fired on Israel. So yes, all of the Gulf states want Iranian attacks to stop, but how do you get that? What is the best means to achieve that? I think there is a degree of disagreement. So with the UAE and I think to a lesser extent Bahrain, there's a belief that the only way you can achieve lasting security is to totally defang Iran, is to address Iran's means of power projection, whether those are its UAVs, its ballistic missiles, its support for regional militia networks. Others like Oman and Qatar have been more in favor of immediate de-escalation because they see the destructive effects that this war is having on their economies, the disruptive effect it's having on global energy security, and they want that to stop. And then you have a degree of ambivalence from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. But what all of these countries share, I think, nevertheless, is a concern that the negotiations could produce a bad deal. Essentially, that Trump, in his eagerness to secure an exit from this conflict, would concede too much for Iran in return for too little. And so essentially, in order to get some nuclear assurances from Iran and to return the Strait of Hormuz back to normalcy, there's a serious concern that Trump would give away quite a lot, including potentially the lifting of sanctions on Iran and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the region. And we know exactly how Iran would use and deploy those financial assets. It would do so in order to rebuild its military arsenal, first and foremost, and then engage in economic reconstruction. So the real concern here is that Trump would sign on to a bad deal from the perspective of the Gulf states that allows Iran to benefit from the lifting of sanctions, that achieves a long-term strategic objective for Iran, which is the expulsion of U.S. forces from the region, and does nothing to address Iran's power projection capabilities through missiles, UAVs, and regional militia networks. And I suspect that this is a concern that Israel shares as well.
You say, Hasan, that that's the real concern, but, and Elham, I want to get your reaction to that perspective, but first, Hasan, you say that's the real concern, but others are saying, no, the real concern now is that we're actually heading toward a frozen or protracted conflict because all sides, whether it's the Gulf partners or the U.S. and Iran, or Israel factoring into the equation? They are far too far apart on what they want to come to any sort of agreement.
There clearly is no shortage of concerns here for all of the parties involved. And yes, I mean, the possibility of the region sliding back into conflict is a real one. The question is, I mean, I think this is a war that Iran doesn't feel like it can walk away from, but President Trump probably does. And I'm not sure that he has the appetite for a long, protracted conflict. So the way I see it is they either secure a deal, and even though I think Trump does prefer to secure an exit ramp and to secure a deal, he's not totally desperate for it at the same time. And I think the Iranians are at risk of overplaying their hand, of really missing an opportunity to secure a deal and an end to this war with the United States. So it's not entirely certain, I agree, that the two sides can agree to a deal. And if that happens, we could slide back into war. But I think this would be a war that the Trump administration will try to end rather quickly, then drag out over time by applying more military force and pressure.
Okay, let me get Elham's position then, according to what Hasan has said.
Yeah, so let's not forget that the Strait of Hormuz was totally completely open before we were attacked by the Americans and the Israelis. So let's try and look at this crisis as it is. It was a completely unnecessary war that was waged on us unilaterally. And the other point is that, you know, it's quite interesting for me how the Persian Gulf states managed to agree on certain issues, whilst for 2.5 years at least, they have not been able to take the least step in order to stop Israeli aggression on the people of Gaza. So I think the only way that we can see the developments in the region is that in a way that everything is tied together. The situation inside Gaza, inside Lebanon, and the conflict that Israel has been waging is totally related to the current war that we are witnessing, the attacks on Iran, and then Iran's decision to make the war a regional one. So I think this is something that needs to be seen as it is. And I think from the Iranian perspective, this could possibly be a situation in which we are going to experience rounds of ceasefires and wars. Maybe it could be a prolonged kind of a Cold War in which a kind of deterrence established, or temporary deterrence established between the sides could just, you know, stop hostilities in a kind of a cold way where we don't have peace, but still we do not have war. But the whole idea that I'm trying to put forward is that Trump has opened a Pandora's box in the region, and he has been very much convinced into doing this by the Israelis, although in social media posts he tried to deny that. Unfortunately, we are in a situation in which he doesn't seem to be in control, and we really cannot predict how this is going to end. The only certainty from the Iranian side is that Iranians are much more focused and much more serious in the way that they are going to defend their country.
Okay. Kevin, I have to apologize. I don't have time to give you a final word, but I'd really like to thank all three of you so much for being with me on this edition of the Newsmakers. Great discussion. Thanks to our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.